Hey, Darshan. So we'll start in about 3 minutes.
Sounds good.
All right.
You already have a full list of 9 people on there already.
Yeah, we do. We had about 254 people register for it.
Oh wow.
So yeah. So I think we'll get quite a few attendees here. We'll see.
I'm
Um,
excited. This should be fun.
yeah, it will be. Well, this topic is an interesting topic. So I think it's a topic that a lot of people, especially in the industry, are really interested in because it's a struggle to be able to support drugs successfully help launch them. So
I'm trying to send it out on my social media as well.
yeah, that'd be great. That would be great. Okay. So thank you everybody for joining me here. My name is William Solomon. I'm with the ACMA. You guys know me. I'm the founder and CEO of the Accreditation Council for Medical Affairs. And I'm excited today because I have with me Darshan Karni, who is well-known podcaster in the world of compliance and regulatory affairs in the pharma industry, really an expert in this area. And so welcome, Darshan, to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited. I'm not usually on this side of the podcast.
Yes, yeah, it's a little bit of a different seat you're in today, huh?
Yeah, but it's fun because I get to talk to smart people like yourself. You were kind enough to be on my podcast recently, and that was super fun, and people enjoyed it. And I'm excited to be here, talk to all these people lining up, and I'm hoping that they find that I've added some value to them.
Thank you very much, Where it's always a pleasure to speak with you. You always have a lot of good insights and ideas, and I'm sure this is a topic that you're going to help give us a lot of interesting perspective on. So, for those of you guys that don't know, so the ACMA, I think most people know, the primary work that we focus on is within the medical affairs space, and it's something we're really passionate about. And just recently, the ACMA, in partnership with a company called Pharma Agile, a well-known company that does a lot of interesting work in the area of drug launches and helps companies in the medical affairs side of the business to launch more effectively and incorporate methods like Agile Methodology that's been incorporated in other industries as well. And so we've worked with them and actually put together a phenomenal new program called the Launch Excellence Certification Program. It's actually the only accredited certification program for launch in the industry focused specifically on medical affairs professionals. Because I don't know if you know this, Darshan, about 36% of drug launches fail. They fail to meet expectations. And, the reality is today, especially, drug launches are difficult, right? There's more competition. There is a greater influence from the payer perspective, right? physicians have made it more difficult to access information. And so all of these things make it really difficult to launch a drug successfully. So I want to get your take on that and kind of what you've seen with your experience, when it comes to drug launches and maybe why they're a challenge.
So my experience is that with drug launches, one of the big things you've got to be aware of is the fact that most companies are so excited to get the product through the FDA process that the drug launch itself is nearly an afterthought. And I don't mean that in a way that they haven't prepared for it, but they don't have a clear goal. And since you don't have a clear goal, one of the big problems you face from that is the fact that it's really hard to work backwards if you don't know, here's what I'm trying to achieve. Now, one of the things you have to account for is, how do you prepare for a pandemic? How do you prepare for a drug launch right after a pandemic? And again, that doesn't speak to the 36% that have failed, but that speaks to a larger, we're in a changing landscape. And if we're in a changing landscape, it's important that we consider what the implications are of that changing landscape and where does that sort of play out. So for example, let's talk a little bit more. I just did a podcast not that long ago, and you can literally listen to it on YouTube as well, and I'm sure you'll put up a link to it. But my podcast, Darshan Talks, and on that, I just spoke to someone who talked about the increasing importance of patient engagement and how medical affairs is playing a huge, valuable role in patient engagement. So the question is, if that's changed, what does a successful product launch look like in that context? How do you engage with patients who are saying, I don't want to meet you anymore? How do you engage with HCPs who are saying, I don't want to meet you anymore? How do you engage with HCPs that say, I like Zoom? And now how do you set that up? And how do you have a conversation with someone who's in their 15th Zoom call today and are not sure how you're going to add any value to them? So I think it comes down to shifting sands regulatorily, but also shifting sands from a compliance perspective and from a new goals perspective. So that's what I think is two of the many challenges: the refocus on patient engagement, the zooming in on it, but also the impact on compliance, the impact on digital. And one of the things we should talk about is also, in terms of product launches, one of the things that I find fascinating, and I just had a very quick conversation about this recently again, was the forgotten HCPs. And what I mean by that is everyone and their brother and their sister wants to talk to physicians, wants to talk to prescribers, and that 100% makes sense because they will decide what product gets prescribed. However, a critical component is talking to pharmacists. And I can tell you that if you're going to have a successful product launch, you're going to be trying to get your patient, your subject, your patient, whatever you want to call it, and depending on the context, into and have them sort of get the product. How do you make sure that they get the product that they need in a way that's appropriate? How do you meet the patient where they are? And often that involves talking to pharmacists. And very few companies make an effort to do that. And then you start getting into additional questions, which is, should medical affairs, and this becomes more of a priority question, should medical affairs be engaged in the question, in the conversation with patients, or is that a separate team? Should medical affairs be engaged in the question or conversation with digital teams? At what point has medical affairs exceeded its scope? And OIG and DOJ are always looking back and saying, have you gone too far? So, and I know you actually just presented with the, I forget, it's the Attorney General's offices?
Yeah, the U.S. Attorney General's. I just gave a presentation. And you're bringing up a lot of hot topics.
Yes.
Each of them could be kind of their own session in and of themselves. But, what I like that you're saying is really that to successfully launch, you've got to get information and input from a variety of stakeholders, right? So pharmacists are important, patient advocacy, members, organizations, patients in general. And I completely agree with you. And this is really why we felt that there was a need to have a program that kind of established best practices when it came to launch from a medical affairs perspective. Because how do you engage patient advocates, for example, appropriately? Because one of the things now, I'm sure you know better than I, is that, like you mentioned, the regulators are looking carefully at how pharma companies are engaging these patient advocacy groups and whether they're ethical, whether there are conflicts of interest from a financial standpoint, et cetera. And I think that, we all agree you should be engaging patient advocates, but how do you do it in a way that is effective, where you're, utilizing that information to help you really meet the needs of these patients, whether it's trying to determine if you have the right clinical trial endpoints in a study, whether your messaging and the story you're telling for the product is an appropriate one, right? These are all things that we need to think about. And I think the one group that we didn't mention that I think is important as well are the payers, right? Because what we're seeing from the ACMA side is that there's a huge need there in terms of both training and understanding of that reimbursement and pricing landscape, but also engaging those payer KOLs or payer thought leaders early on. So I would absolutely agree with you. I think that's really key. What are you seeing, from your side, I guess, because you're kind of giving your background, kind of where you sit, from a compliance standpoint around what are some of the things that you think medical affairs leaders, pharma companies in general, need to be mindful of when they're engaging, interacting with patient advocacy organizations?
So it's a bit of a loaded question, isn't it? So and I'll talk about it in general. The beauty of patient engagement is, in the end, that's why, quite honestly, most of us got into healthcare, to help the patient. And as a lawyer, as someone who's a compliance professional, what I learn, and this is problematic, is there's such a thing as too much of a good thing. And that's the weirdest part. I'm helping patients. How can there be too much of helping patients? And the answer is when the helping is not for the purpose of helping, but the helping is with a nefarious goal or outcome. And it may not be nefarious at the front of your mind, but it could be a nefarious goal in the back of your mind, and that's the hardest part. So things like copay assistance programs. People would say copay assistance is great. It helps patients in a scenario where they may not be able to afford the drug. If the company can pay for the copay, wouldn't that be a great thing? Yeah, that's not the greatest idea in the world when you're working with government payers, and sometimes with non-government payers, because what you land up with is a scenario where the patient is now not incentivized to choose the drug that may be right for them, but the drug that is cheapest for them. And the drug that's cheapest for them might be the most expensive drug, but the cost has been sort of taken care of in other ways. Another way might be how you engage with the patient. So one big component of that, and there was a great study done a few years ago out of Georgetown, and they talked a little bit about how pharma companies, through their various engagement platforms, went in and basically what they tried to do was tell a patient, you know what we should do? You should come in and be an intern for us. And now the question is, that sounds like a good thing in concept, but are you doing it because this patient is getting, in the case that they outlined, it was blood factors, and every individual hospitalization for the patient was $1 million for the company. So getting your patient to be on your product was massive. But now that's where medical affairs comes in. They're going, let me talk to you, let me engage you, let me talk to you about how we set this up. And that education and that experience, I'm not trying to sell you anything. I just want your life to be better. And what does that look like? And how do you do that? So to me, that's going to be, those are some of the initial jump off points to consider. Obviously, then there are the big other ones, which are like digital questions and digital considerations. So how do you ensure compliance? And you're sending that through your MLR committees, if you will, and sometimes you're sending it through other review committees. But those are other considerations to have when you're talking about patient-facing, patient engagement processes.
How far in advance do you think you need to begin building out a field medical team when you're getting ready to plan for a launch? I'm curious, what your thoughts are, because I've seen different things across different companies we work with on the medical care side. Kind of what's your take on it?
See, I don't think there's a right answer, though, is there? Because I think it comes down to your product, and it comes down to the engagement, and I think it comes down to the company and your own development. The sooner the better is what everyone and their mother will say, and that's probably true. But what does sooner the better mean? Does it mean phase one? I think phase one, it's pushing it to have someone come in early phase one. You don't know if the product's even going to make it. But it's pretty safe to say phase two, some point in phase two is probably a good idea to start saying, I want to start prepping for it. I find companies doing it every so often around phase 3A, 3B, and now you're cutting it close, and 3B especially. But I think phase two is probably your best bet, if you will. What's your take? How do you normally see it done?
So I think it depends on a few things. I think it depends on the therapeutic area you're in. I think it depends on how well you've mined and fleshed out that KOL landscape. If you're working in a landscape where you have already been in that therapeutic area, you know who the KOLs are, you can probably start a little bit later. But if there's a lot of upfront work you need to do, then I think you need to start earlier. It's like, I remember one time I had a job where in the city, in Manhattan, and during my lunch break, sometimes I would go out and I would have lunch in this cafe, and in front of this cafe, they were doing construction. And these construction workers were building this huge, massive building, like, they do in the city, big skyscrapers. And in the beginning, right, what they spend the majority of their time on is actually building the foundation. And I always think to myself, like 3 months have gone by and it doesn't look like they've done much. It's just really the foundation. They're digging more and more a hole into the ground to really solidify that foundation. And once that foundation's in place, bam, the rest of the building goes up quickly. And I think it's a good analogy for a good drug launch, right? Is that you need to have a good foundation. You need to have a good team in place. You need to have good processes. You need to have good coordination among the different functional groups. And if that foundation's there, executing, which would be a lot of maybe more of what would look like the superficial things, once those systems are in place, it's going to go quickly. So I think that's critical, to have that and to look at that early on. Let's talk a little bit about Agile methodology. Now, Agile methodology, is a methodology where I think mostly probably in big tech it's been used a lot in Silicon Valley, where when you're developing, an MVP, a minimum viable product, you are constantly getting input from external stakeholders. You're getting input, you're making changes and tweaks, you're going back and getting the input, right? And you're doing it in a stepwise fashion. And in the pharmaceutical industry, I think, we've been a little late to adopt that type of mentality, right? There's some, I would say, a very small minority that are doing that, but we're kind of beginning to see how can we adopt that. And that's actually, our approach in the Launch Excellence Certification Program. It's really about how do you adopt, an agile mentality and approach to launching a drug. So I'm just curious, when you talked about it a little bit in terms of engaging patients, but what's your take on that in general? Is this approach really a sustainable one in the industry, in the pharmaceutical industry?
I mean, I think Agile as a concept has been around for a little while at this point, and it's not that different from the PDCA cycle, which has literally been there since the 70s. And it's what Toyota used to become successful, and Motorola used to be bought out by Google, and a large variety of pharma companies did. All your auditing programs in pharma companies are really working off of the PDCA cycle, which is very similar to the Agile process. And I think, therefore, there's tons of good data to support and recommend a process like Agile. And so what am I thinking about? I'm thinking about, in general, the Agile process is define, design, build, test, release. That's their basic premise, if you will. The key portion is identify what you're trying to achieve. Until you know what you're trying to achieve, it's how are you going to be successful at something if you don't know what success looks like? And I think that's the key component. Then design. So once you know what you're aiming for, now you can build the foundation, as you just put it. And I think that gives you a timeline. It lets you sort of organize your resources. One of the things I've seen people do is try to build the car and drive the car at the same time. And that's obviously problematic. Using a process like Agile, using alternative processes, in the end, what you're really coming down to is allocate the resources at the appropriate time. Build based on once you've sort of outlined what you're trying to achieve, you sort of start training people, talking to people, making sure they have the right resources in place. And then there's test and release. And that's that iterative component you're talking about, which is you might build something with the best of intentions, but the fact is that your needs are going to change, your people are different, your situation's different, and you're going to incrementally be creating a better, stronger process, which leads to better product launches. And that would be my thought process. But here's my question for you. We jumped off the last question. I want to ask you a question because you mentioned it, but I didn't quite get the answer. So you're talking about building that foundation. Do you talk about that foundation as a phase one process, or do you see that, or is that too soon in your opinion? Because I've been trying to narrow this down for a while, honestly, and I'm always trying to figure out how smart people see it.
I think phase two, to me, is where you want to do it because you've collected more data, right, on population of interest, and you've gotten some signals as to where things are headed. So, as a company, you've also got to think about the investment of time and resources, right, and the cost to build out the infrastructure for all this. So I'd want to get some indication that, the chances of approval are high, right? Because as you know, things can happen. We saw what happened recently with Biogen, and I have to ask you about that with the Biogen debacle. It's one of those things that it did surprise me. I think that's a great example and very timely to our conversation about drug launches. The FDA actually, Janet Woodcock, who I know very well, herself questioning, whether or not the interactions between her team and Biogen were on the up and up. What are your thoughts on that?
So let me ask you this question, because I'm not. Here's my perspective. I tend to defer to the FDA for the most part. I tend to truly believe that as an organization, they do try their absolute best to help patients, and that's where they come from. They don't come from, let me help industry. That's just not their goal. I mean, in the end, helping industry is with the goal of helping patients. So I come from that perspective. Now, it's really hard to defend someone who's saying, we want output from a panel of experts, and we're then just going to disregard them and do what we want anyways. Well, why did you have a panel of experts anyways? We're just looking for validation. The question you get out of that, and you talk about Janet Woodcock, I feel like, again, I've met Janet Woodcock. I don't know her as well as you probably do, but she was, how should I put this, cagey about it, in that she admits that she wants an independent investigation into it. But I did also feel like her response was, don't ask me too many more questions about this. So I don't know if she knows what to make of what's happened, because I think that there have been multiple instances where the FDA has not gone with the majority opinion of an advisory board. So in her head, she's almost wondering, why is this so different? Again, I'm putting words in her mouth. I have no idea if that's true. But that was my take on it. First of all, that's the Janet Woodcock question. What's your opinion on that, though? Do you think she has a similar opinion, or am I putting, like, that's not what you saw, what you read?
I mean, it's tough to say, right? I'm not, just like you, I'm not necessarily, behind kind of the curtains knowing exactly what's gone on. It's funny, I talked to her a few days right before this. None of this obviously came up, but what I know of her is that, she's someone that is committed to making sure that the right standards and protocols and formalities are followed.
Yeah.
I that I applaud her for doing it. I mean, as a leader, to take a look at your own organization and say, hey, we need to make sure that we were doing things correctly. I meet a lot of leaders, quite frankly, who aren't willing to kind of stick their neck out. And that's one of my biggest pet peeves, right? Is leaders who, I'll hear leaders say to me, well, I'm afraid to do so and so because I'm worried my team is going to be upset. And to me, that's like, well, you really shouldn't be a leader then, right? And some people might not like to hear me say that, but I'm a big believer in that. I mean, if you're a leader, you're there to serve in what is in the best interest of your team. Sometimes even if your team doesn't know it, right? Sometimes even if your team doesn't know it. And I think that's, Janet, in her defense, I think while probably a lot of team members were upset about that, she was trying to do what she thought was best for the FDA long term and riding the credibility of the FDA. So I guess it remains to be seen what's going to happen. So we have 7 minutes left, and I want to be respectful of your time. It goes by quick. We're having fun, so it goes by quick. But I want to turn it to the attendees on the Zoom and see what questions they have. So I'm going to open it up, and maybe we'll give them a minute or two and see what questions come in, and we can take some of the questions. So if you have a question, feel free to type it in, and then we'll try to respond.
For sure.
And while I'm waiting for that, one of the questions I had gotten on LinkedIn was about the Launch Excellence Certification Program. So that program, it's actually a program that's all online. It's self-paced, and it's a program that's made up of modules, very similar to the Board Certified Medical Affairs Specialist program. It's run by folks that really have a lot of experience in this area, over 30 years of experience with launch. So, all right, here we got a question. Agile often gets stuck in MLR. This is a good question for you, Darshan. Do you have any recommended strategies? And I've seen this. This is frustrating, sitting in those MLR meetings. What do you think?
So I serve on MLR committees because I'm a lawyer, but I'm also a pharmacist, and I also have a master's in quality assurance regulatory affairs. So oddly, I'm a one-man MLR. But the key pieces to remember is MLR in the end is people. We want to understand what you're doing, and sometimes it gets stuck because you aren't communicating. So my advice is, if you want to sort of address MLR issues, is explain what you're trying to do so that the people who are in the committee can tell you, okay, this is what you're trying to achieve. You can go down this path for XYZ reasons, but have you considered ABC instead, or PQR? And when you start having those conversations, that back and forth may give you a way to reach your goal without sort of getting into this loop of, well, this is what we want to do in this verse. This is the only direction we can proceed. It may not sometimes be exactly what you had in mind, but my experience has been, for the most part, that when you're engaging with MLR, they want to make it work just as much as you do, because you don't want to be the guy who's slowing everything down.
Right. I completely agree. I mean, the only additional point I'd add to that, those are all great points, is I always used to tell my team, medical team, do the work beforehand. So send information beforehand, have a conversation beforehand. So when you're at MLR, that isn't the time where you're bringing up the topic for the first time. You know what I mean? So I'm a big believer of doing the prep work beforehand to make sure that, the MLR meeting runs as smoothly as possible. So, for what it's worth, I hope that helps. But, MLR meetings can be very difficult meetings to get through. And sometimes, listen, I mean, I'm just being honest. Sometimes you have difficult people who are sometimes there just to make things difficult,
Yeah.
So, anyway, another question that we have, do you involve them in a Scrum or a Sprint update? So do you involve them in a Scrum or Sprint update? These are the MLR folks. What are your thoughts on that?
Generally speaking, I'm not sure MLR would be involved in the Scrum update, because things change, things adapt, and you're getting preemptive feedback. I mean, you can always get the feedback. There's nothing wrong with getting it. My experience has been that MLR is often really, really busy. So being pulled into additional Scrum meetings may be difficult. So it may be piling onto a schedule that they may already have very little control over because of how busy they tend to be. Not saying it's a bad idea, I'm just saying practically it's difficult to do.
Right, right. Yeah, no, I would agree. I would absolutely agree. So we have about 2 minutes left. Any closing comments from you, Darshan, in general
Well,
about this topic?
there's one more question from Taylor. Do you mind if I read it and go
Oh,
from
I
there?
didn't see that. Yeah, yeah, go ahead. I didn't see that. Go ahead.
What information should be provided to pharmacists during a drug launch, and what information will be valuable to them? So I'll tell you from my experience as a pharmacist, I've worked in most pharmacy settings, everything ranging from retail pharmacy to hospital to long-term care to et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Here's the big question you really end up trying to answer. What is the impact of this drug in the treatment portfolio that I have for my patients? So what I'm trying to figure out is I have 5 drugs, 2 of them are on formulary. Yours is or isn't. Why should I go with your drug? That's the first question. What role does it play in treatment? And I recognize that sales and marketing can tell me one answer, and that's what they've been approved for, and that's great. But that's why I need to know all the other information. I need to have a broader understanding. The second question that I get, that I as a pharmacist always had to deal with, is how do I afford my drug? And now there are several resources, several tools out there, and that comes back to questions like who are the right partnerships? Are you talking to a WebMD? Are you talking to a GoodRx? Are you talking to Amazon? To make sure that when your drug comes out, it's going to be in a way, in a format, in a price that patients can go, I'm comfortable working with you, and I can afford this drug. Because a lot of patients will push back, and I'll tell you this as a patient myself. If I get a drug that is too expensive, I don't even know if it's too expensive. I'm just going to actively try to figure out how I can avoid that. So you need to preemptively address my concerns in a way that when I go to the pharmacist, I'm being educated in, yes, this is good for your health, and here's how you'll be able to afford it without completely breaking the bank. And for some drugs, that's possible, but we all know of drugs where that's almost impossible. So that conversation, that engagement will be critical as we continue.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think the cost issue, the pricing is huge. To me, my advice would be you got to factor that in. How does this drug compare to the other drugs in its class? If it's a first in class, what will it do to mitigate some of those costs? I think especially when you're talking to pharmacists and payers, et cetera, it's a big deal. All right, so we're right at the top of the half hour. I want to thank you very much, Darshan. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. I know I'm going to be with you, I think August 12th we're together, so I'm looking forward to that. I want to thank all the attendees as well. And again, if you have any questions in general, you can always reach out to me or Darshan on LinkedIn directly. Have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.